UNDRIP, the United Nations Declaration on the Rights of Indigenous Peoples. It's being sold to the world as a human rights movement, a means to free Indigenous peoples from poverty, discrimination, and a lifetime of physical and substance abuse. The reality, for a large majority of them. I know. I worked on a reserve as a paramedic when I was younger. The conditions were deplorable. If only UNDRIP was the human rights tool it claims to be. But it's not. It's a weapon, to be used to undermine the sovereignty of UN member countries, to control their resources, and to put political power into the hands of the globalists. And it won't help the Indigenous peoples one bit. Leighton Grey is a constitutional lawyer in Alberta. He speaks out regularly on the threats to our country on his own podcast, Grey Matter. He is the man behind a number of legal actions against the provincial government for their COVID response, and to date the only lawyer in Canada to successfully call a public health officer to the stand. Leighton is also Indigenous. Recently, Leighton wrote an excellent essay on the threat to our national sovereignty posed by UNDRIP. He joins me today to explain how it will really be used, where it fits into the globalist agenda, and what we can do to stop it. Leighton, it's a pleasure to have you back on the show.
Thank you, Will. It's always a pleasure talking with you.
Now, I reached out to you to invite you to this interview because you wrote this fantastic article on UNDRIP. And folks, for those of you who aren't familiar, it's the UN Declaration on the Rights of Indigenous Peoples. And there was a statement in there that I think sums up everything we're going to talk about today to alert people to what this is. And I'm going to quote John Kim Bell, who you quoted in the article. He's an Indigenous businessman and leader. And he said, implementing UNDRIP would probably paralyze the entire Canadian economy. And having read your article and read some of the articles that are in UNDRIP, I don't think that's an overstatement.
No, I don't think so either. And, the problem with UNDRIP is, as you and I were talking about before we came on camera, is it fits in very nicely with this whole liberal government jigsaw puzzle, where they've tied the Canadian people and our nation into a globalist plan that serves the interests of people who do not live in our country and do not have Canadians' best interests in mind. And really what you're dealing with UNDRIP is the surrender of sovereignty over Canadian lands, which is really the essential, when you go right down to the bottom, it's the soil of nationhood. You can't go any deeper. And that's what UNDRIP is. And it's a surrender not to Indigenous peoples. That's important to remember. I call this in the paper a Trojan horse. The surrender is not to Indigenous peoples who've received more than $1 trillion of government largesse over the past 30 years to no effect. The surrender of Canadian soil is to the globalist interests, the same ones who are, who authored, the COVID-19 pandemic, who are authoring climate scare right now, who have authored the treaty, the WHO pandemic treaty, of which Canada is a signatory, which cedes essentially all Canadian authority, government decision-making over health emergencies. And of course, the definition of a health emergency is so broad that it includes virtually everything.
It's whatever they say it is.
That's what you're dealing. Yeah, that's what UNDRIP is. It's just a piece of the puzzle. It's the land piece. And what people, especially in rich provinces like we have in Canada, need to understand is that Canada is a resource-rich country, and our resources are coveted by these global interests. And they want to have the land so that they can harvest those resources, not for our benefit, but for their benefit. And if people want to see what this looks like, you can now watch online videos of Chinese owned and operated cobalt and lithium mines in the Congo, with little children and pregnant women digging on their hands and knees in toxic sludge, the most severe form of racism, actual racism that exists on this planet. And unfortunately, and at risk of overstating it, this program UNDRIP has the potential, in combination with other, liberal government globalist agendas and policies and laws now, has the real potential to literally enslave Canadians.
Yeah. And I think the important point, you were talking about land, but I might suggest that the better thing we should be talking about here is the resources, because that's what they're really after. And part of the plan, of course, is to control supply chains. And so I wanted to, and I was talking to you about this before the interview. When I read your article, the one thing that jumped right out at me right here, I'm going to read it for you folks, Article 26 of UNDRIP. And this is a quote. Indigenous people have the right to the lands, territories, and resources which they have traditionally owned, occupied, or otherwise used or acquired. Well, that sounds an awful lot to me like those of us who have white skin might as well just pack our bags and move back to Europe because we're handing the country back to them. And you go on to talk about this giving them veto power over development of resources.
Right.
And there's over 600 tribes in Canada that would potentially have this veto power.
Right.
Well, what a fantastic method of control, because here's the problem, folks. If you criticize this, you're a racist.
Yes. And, it's important for people to understand also that this is not sort of pie in the sky, down the road, world of ideology stuff. Right now, today, the city of Vancouver is being ceded, legally ceded, given up to Indigenous groups. So that Indigenous groups, on the basis of UNDRIP, because the province of British Columbia has signed this into law, UNDRIP. And it is on the move, and it is they are literally giving away or giving back. Of course, that's a fallacy because, of course, there never was any type of land ownership. That concept did not exist when European settlers arrived. They discovered civilizations that had not yet even discovered the wheel. Civilizations that were cannibalistic, that were brutal, that were warlike. That operated according to the rule of conquest. And it was actually the European settlers, and Indigenous people don't like to hear this, but it was European settlers that brought civilization, that brought peace, and really all the things that most Indigenous people enjoy today are the result of European entry into this land space. Now, that I don't want to say that has been perfect, but I think that we all need to disabuse our minds of this ridiculous leftist fantasy that before European contact, that Indigenous peoples lived in some sort of idyllic utopia where they ran around sniffing flowers, and the buffalo just sort of laid down and let people eat them. It was a brutal time when they lived outside of industrialization. They had no concept of fossil fuels or coal or even the use of horses for hunting. And it was a brutal time where people literally were at war with the planet, at war with each other, and most of the time, starved to death. And so, I mean, the poorest Indigenous person in Canada today is still one of the richest people in the history of civilization. And it's important to remember this because sort of underlying all of this UNDRIP and all of this fawning over Indigenous rights to virtually everything is a presumption that the land is stolen and that we have the people who arrived afterwards have no right to it. Well, that just begs the question: if that's true, then why is the Liberal government so committed to immigration? They've got a plan to bring in 1.5 million people into Canada, and I can tell you, if you look at the literature, what's online, the way Canada is being advertised to potential immigrants, they're not saying that Canada is this systemically racist country where all the land is stolen. They're being told, people who are invited to come here, being told this is the land of milk and honey. And it is. It really is, if we just learn to be grateful for it and learn to share it and unite under one banner and one flag. And that's Canada.
And I think we have to do that. I think we have to remember our history. As you're talking there, the first thing that occurs to me is that you're going to be accused of colonialism for what you just said.
Of course.
And we've got Parks Canada right now rewriting some 200 plaques in our provincial and federal parks to change the colonial nature of them. And before anybody accuses either of us of racism, I think that this is a good place to point out that you yourself, I believe, are half Aboriginal.